Okay, so we're ready to start. First of all, welcome everyone to this webinar. My name is Rafael Fernandez. I am a postdoctoral research fellow working with Professor Dina Dayala in the UNESCO Chair in Disaster Risk Reduction and Resilience Engineering. In the framework of this chair, we have the webinar series, and today we are very happy to have Dr. Chris White and Dr. Marcelo Arosio with a webinar titled Multi-Hazard Interaction, Cascading Impacts and Indicators. Just before giving them the word, we just want to recap and update on different events that had happened in the previous couple of months during the summer, in which we have not had any webinar. The first one is the attendance to the World Conference of Earthquake Engineering in Milan, in which we presented 3 different papers. We went with Professor Dina, and it was a very good experience to connect and to meet many of you. Then back in London, we attended to the UNESCO UK Chairs National Meeting, in which we met with more than 30 different chairs across the UK, with the objective of building partnerships to contribute to sustainable development goals. This event was hosted at UCL, and it was a great opportunity to see what other disciplines are working and how this specific and detailed work can be synchronized and can be coordinated towards the same objective that at the end are the sustainable development goals. Also, we had a workshop in the Philippines, organized as part of a seed grant project titled Decision Support Tool for Infrastructure Resilience, supported by Deloitte's Register Foundation, and in particular with the Institute for the Public Understanding of Risk. The objective of this project is to develop affordable and accessible decision support tool to empower local communities in developing countries. In this event, Dr. Asana Paramel Bateri from the UNESCO Chair, she's also a research fellow. She presented some of the work that we have been doing in the Philippines, joined by Dr. Ji Yoon Byun from the University of Glasgow, Professor Xian Xiao Chen of the National University of Singapore, and Professor Dexter Law from Xavier University. Also on the 12th of September, we hosted a meeting with Professor Dongping Pang, the Dean of the School of Civil Engineering at Tsinghua University in China, and we discussed the different future collaborative activities between the 2 institutions, Tsinghua University and UCL. And one of the immediate actions about this collaboration is that on October we have scheduled another webinar titled Human-Centered and Data-Driven Approaches to Enhancing Urban Resilience that will be delivered by Professor Dongping Fang and Associate Professor Nan Li, together with Saishang Li, another research fellow from here at the UNESCO Chair. Besides this one in October, we have also scheduled 2 additional webinars. In December, we have one for related of freshwater scarcity in coastal Bangladesh due to water salinity and the future risk of rising sea levels by Professor Mohammad Shamsuda. And in February, we have scheduled one talk about tall and resilient timber buildings by Professor Solomon Tesfamarian. So going to what brings us together today, the webinar that we will have is titled Multi-Hazard Interaction, Cascading Impacts and Indicators. We are very glad to have here Dr. Chris White and Dr. Marcelo Arosio. Dr. Chris White is the head of the Center of Water Environment, Sustainability and Public Health at the University of Strathclyde in Glasgow. He leads the Engineering for Extreme Research Group, focusing on improving and understanding extreme weather events, hydrometeorological hazards, and water resource management. Dr. White is currently leading the Multi-Hazard Interaction and Cascading Impacts work package of the MEDiate project, a project funded by the Horizon Europe program of the European Commission. We also have Dr. Marcelo Arosio. He's an assistant professor in flood risk assessment at U's Pavia. He is specialized in disaster risk assessment. He has more than 12 years of expertise in climate-related natural hazard. His experience includes climate-proofing infrastructure, climate risk management, and water risk assessment. He has worked in different UN institutions in different countries, such as Vietnam and Thailand. Currently, he's also actively involved in design package of multi-hazard interaction and cascading impacts from the MEDiate research project. So without further ado, Dr. Chris and Marcello, the floor is yours. Thank you again for participating.
Rafael, thank you very much. Thank you for the introduction. Hello, everyone. I'm Chris White, as Rafael just introduced. Bear with me just 1 second. I'll just get my slides ready, and hopefully, Rafael, that's all good. You can see that okay?
Yeah, perfect.
Okay, good. Right, thank you. So the broad topic that Marcello and I are going to cover today, I was going to say this afternoon, depending on which time zone you're in, actually, so whether it's the morning or the afternoon, so I'll just say today, is multi-hazard interactions, cascading impacts and indicators. Marcello is going to follow me looking at the multi-hazard indicator component of the work, some of the work we've been doing and more broadly. I'm going to focus first off, though, around what I've termed as these sort of complex multi-hazard interactions, the cascading impacts part of this topic of the story today. The center, or one of the running themes through this, is the MEDiate project, which was just indicated at the beginning. But this isn't a talk specifically about the MEDiate project, but I will touch on certain elements of some of the work we've been doing and some of the future plans coming from that project. But more broadly, it's around this as a topic, some sort of high-level insights and perhaps recommendations and perspectives on that. Before I get into it, though, I just want to acknowledge many of the people that have contributed both to many of the projects that I've been involved in, including the MEDiate project, and also some of the slides that I'll show here today. Some or most of them are named on the screen here, but there's probably more that I haven't mentioned. So hopefully everyone gets the credit that's due to them. So I'll start first off with the topic of, or rather trying to understand the challenges around multi-hazard interactions, cascading impacts. This is by definition, a very complex topic, a very interconnected topic. And I think therein also lays some of the potential, but also some of the challenges that are associated with it. So what I want to do in the first bit of my talk is kind of almost start, that's not quite the beginning, but certainly at the very high level, to try and understand and unpick some of the terms and definitions that we are using, we're all interested in, all using when we talk about this, again, by definition, this complex topic. I'm just going to start right at the top, which is the IPCC perspective or view on this topic. Now, in the 6th assessment report, the IPCC, in their summary, came up with complex, compound, and cascading risks. And they had their diagrams, the propeller, which I'll focus on a little bit more, the risk propeller, both in the current, future, and current climate and future climate. And it came up with this term, which is complex, compound, and cascading risks. Now, in this, I think the IPCC did a really good job at bringing together pretty much every definition and every word that we all, to some degree, use as we are referring to interconnected hazards and risks. So the IPCC rightly pointed out the grand challenge, I think, that is associated with compounding and complex risks, but also, to some degree, I want to say, reintroduced or highlighted the complexity of this topic. In this section of text alone, we have terms like multiple climate hazards, simultaneous, climatic, non-climatic, interacting, overall risk, cascading risk. Everything is in this statement. And whilst that's good from a high level and a snapshot, it actually makes it quite challenging then to understand this as a topic. And most importantly is, how do we address this from a risk reduction perspective? So what I want to try and do in this first bit is try and unpick this a bit to say, well, why? Why do we care? Why are we interested in these challenges? What are they? And then we can start to lay out some of the existing work and perhaps future work that needs to happen to try and address this complexity, maybe even try and make things a bit simpler rather than just continuously adding more words and more layers to it. So I've got kind of three motivations, I suppose, for this talk, or three motivations for where I think this piece of work, this area of work needs to go. The first one, of course, is just, let's say, the simple one, which is the limitations of single hazard thinking. We're all probably used to dealing with hazards in the singular. We work within disciplines, within silos. It's also easier to think about a particular event or a particular hazard or particular disaster in somewhat in isolation or in an independent way. The example that I've got on the screen here, this is from colleagues at a sister project, which is MEDiate. This highlights, though, a sequence of events. In this case, this is 3 storms hitting the UK and sort of northwestern Europe back in 2021. Each of these storms, whilst in some ways they are connected to the large-scale climate patterns that surround them, these 3 storms of Dudley, Eunice, Franklin, all came from different directions, all had different impacts, but all therefore had, let's say, increased impacts because of the sequencing between them. So the focus on one storm versus a sequence during 3 storms means we're underprepared for events like this when we think of hazards in the singular. And of course, our systems are complex, whether we're talking about climate hazards, geological hazards. Hazards by definition really aren't single, they are interdependent. In a climate space, which is where I typically work, there's a great understanding that a lot of things are connected to each other, and therefore that our hazards, especially on the climate hazard perspective, are rarely caused by a single event or a single hazard. It's actually a combination of either different factors, preceding or co-occurring events. And these can happen over large spatial times or either large spatial areas or over large temporal times. So there are clear limitations of what we think of in terms of single hazards, and that move then to thinking about more joined up multi-hazards. The second one is around impacts. Now, I've mentioned the word impact already. Impacts, of course, are a way of, let's say, measuring the events that occur, because we can measure things of how many times they occur, what the losses are, or the fatalities, for example, that might be caused by a particular event. Now, that single hazard way of thinking is, I suppose, the traditional way. So using MEDiate, the global hazard database, we can start to account for how many hazards are in there and the losses they occur. But there are other ways, and we showed this in a paper which we produced and published earlier this year, where we said, well, actually, you can reframe and re-quantify many of these events as being multi-hazard events. In other words, a combination of more than one hazard has come together to create an impact. And simply on the screen here, I've got 2 colors, the light blue and the dark blue. The light blue are what we call single hazard events. So in the database, they're just being recorded as a single event, a single hazard event. And the dark blue are the multi-hazard events. These are things where 2 things co-occur. And if you look here, I'll just pick out storms. In the database, it's a global database, over 100 years or so of data. In this database, just over 70% of those events that occur that are recorded in MEDiate will be classified as single hazard events, 28% therefore multi-hazard events. But when you move across to the losses component, it's almost a reverse. Nearly 70% of the losses occur as a consequence of those 28% of multi-hazard events. So the disproportionate impacts that come from multi-hazard events is becoming more striking and I think more evident with more research and evidence that we're building. And it's not just evidence, of course, you can connect this to large-scale global efforts from the World Bank, from the IPCC, the Sendai framework. There are multiple reports and initiatives out there that are all calling for a greater understanding, better quantification of multi-hazard, so complex and multi-hazard interactions and their impacts. So we need to understand these a lot more. And then most importantly, or perhaps as importantly, is then of course we need to prepare better for them. So with better understanding, better knowledge and evidence, then we can work together to prepare for them better. This is from the chair of the UK's Climate Change Committee, or the Adaptation Committee here in the UK. So there's, of course, a bit of a UK flavour to many of my slides here today, which simply says that the UK is underprepared for cascading impacts. So the impacts that come from how hazards affect our networks and our systems. So there are three key components that I want to kind of, or themes really, or motivations that I want to then focus on. But before then, I want to give a couple of really good tangible examples of what do we mean. A lot of these terms are interchangeable, and I want to come back to that point as we go through. But all these terms do have a real world application or real world meaning. For those that may or may not know what is on the screen here, this is day 0. This is from 2018 in Cape Town, where the city was facing significant drought and a potential for the taps to be turned off because of lack of water. And I want to just give this as a quick example of where an event which combines both hazards and a cascade of risk can then lead to a very dire, potentially catastrophic situation. And I was highlighting the interdependencies between both the hazards and our systems. So in 2018, Cape Town had been experiencing a significant drought, a 3-year drought at this point, and reservoir levels were extremely low. And early in 2018, the government for Cape Town recognized that if projections and the levels of reservoirs continue to drop as they were, by May 2018, they would run out of water. And so 11th of May was termed 0 day. And 0 day was when the water would drop below a level, and quite simply, the taps would have to be turned off by the government. What then ensued over the next few weeks and months was a campaign for all the residents of Cape Town, nearly 4 million people, to significantly reduce water consumption to something like 50 litres a day, which for some countries, that sounds like a lot, and perhaps in many countries, that's not that much. And to avert the worst case scenario, which is taps being turned off. Now, it's easy to think of that as an event that was caused by a drought. And whilst, of course, that was the main driving factor, it was the trigger, really, that caused the event, it's actually a combination of a range of other factors that then move us from hazards into interdependencies around risks, so vulnerabilities and exposure. Because those 3 years of low rainfall and drought aligned with, or coincided with, I suppose, a lot of other factors like increasing population and urbanization. There's a large city driven by years of economic growth, saw a boom and expansion of the city, therefore more pressure on the water systems. That meant over usage of water, probably poor water management and maintenance, but most importantly, limited worst case planning for what could happen in the event of a series of circumstances, in this case, a series of droughts over a number of years. There was no contingency and no redundancy in the system, which then meant the Cape Town was facing a very catastrophic situation. It's a really good example, therefore, of where hazards can either interact or can happen over a long period of time, or in sequence, in this case, 3 droughts, that then lead on to or connect with our systems and cause significant impacts. Another example here, this is from France in 2016, crop failure in 2016. Again, easy to think that crop failure is caused by probably not enough rain occurring, which meant the crops failed. However, it's not just a single event. And this, again, I want to highlight here is why multi-hazard events are so complex. Because in this case, it was a warm autumn and winter in the preceding year, followed by a very wet spring. By the time they got to the summer, crops had failed, led to the large-scale failure. So when you can trace this back, again, the complexity of both understanding the needs of our systems and how our systems work, as well as the interactions between the hazards themselves in the first place. Now, connecting to this, we then are, let's say, left with, or we have to work with, a range of definitions, going from hazard, multi-hazard, compound, and so forth, all the way through to risk and multi-risk. I've used a lot of them already in this talk. I'm not expecting you to read the screen here because it's a pretty awful screen. Luckily, some people before me have had a fairly good go at trying to understand and unpack some of these definitions. But also recognize, and I started with the IPCC, is that even in the IPCC AR6, the Sixth Assessment Report, the Simpson paper in 2021 that was published, highlighted that actually a lot of the words that were used in the IPCC were also not defined. So we have these high-level definitions of compound risk, emergent risk, interconnected risk, interdependent risk, and so forth, but without definition, or they're used in multiple ways. On the top right, again, there's another paper here which starts to try and define those. And on the bottom right, this is from the UK, and this is relating to the most recent UK climate risk assessment, CCRA3, which I'll refer to a little bit further forward. So we've got this range of different definitions, many of which are interchangeable. So let's stick here with the IPCC SIG report, going to the risk propeller that I'm sure we're all somewhat familiar with. And again, from the Simpson paper, they highlighted where some of those words are being used relating to either hazard, exposure, or vulnerability. And as you can see, many of those words are being used interchangeably. In particular, of course, the word interacting and multi. And then translate that across, again, I'm using a UK example. This is from the most recent UK Climate Change Risk Assessment Report. Here, the focus on the interacting part is not on the hazards, but is simply on the risk systems and the interdependencies between our risk systems. So we've got these are just two examples, one at the global level, one at the country level. But it's very interesting to see how these same words are being used on both sides. So we have this kind of differing approach where we're describing, let's say, complex risk, but we're also talking about interactions, the physical connections, interactions between hazards. But we're also talking about how risks propagate and connect through our networks and man-made systems. So these two approaches, I'm going to just slightly separate out here, which is on one hand, we have the interacting hazards, and on the other hand, we have cascading impacts. Now, these two are not completely independent, and I'm not trying to suggest they are, but from a management, a quantification, and understanding perspective, actually having these two slightly separate actually enables us to have a clearer and let's say a simpler conversation around either the hazards and the complexities and the interactions between hazards, or those complexities that talk about how risk can cascade. Now, on this part here, I'm using interacting to mean hazard and cascade to mean impact. And of course, again, we've often seen those two terms will interchange. The one thing, though, that I think this particular diagram, this is from the C40 report back in 2017, is there's limited discussion here around actually how some of these hazards also interact. This is more around how hazards interact with impacts, but actually there's a broader or wider piece, which is how the hazards themselves interact. Now, we've got a series of typologies. There's different ways in which we can quantify the first. So this is how hazards interact with each other. This is a bit more from the compound event community. This is a paper by Geisler et al. In 2020, which I'm sure many of us perhaps are familiar with, which tries to quantify the different types of interacting hazards, from preconditioned, so something has to happen before something else happens, multivariate, so this kind of co-occurring side, And then you've got temporally or spatially compounding. So they happen either in sequence in time or occur passing two areas, but affecting. And you can have different examples, of course, of each. And again, this helps us. This helps quantify things a little bit, but also then introduces, of course, more terms that we have to deal with. And when we're talking about multi-hazards and the interactions between hazards, that spatial and temporal scale is really key. It's really important because a lot of the events that we're talking about all operate on different spatial and time scales. Everything from a flash flood will happen very quickly on often a very small scale compared to a drought. We just talked about the Cape Town example of a multi-year drought, completely different timescales. But often there's that notion, that understanding that a drought is often ended with extreme or very heavy rainfall and often flooding. So there's a connection, a clear physical connection, as well as the more standard and understanding of interconnected hazards. So spatial and timescale is important. And so again, there's a couple of studies here. This is from a 2022 paper that starts to connect these timescales, both in terms of where they occur in a spatial sense, but also temporally. And then this then brings us a little bit back towards the risk side, because within the time scale, the temporal scale, you've got the temporal scale for the occurrence of the hazard, but also then the time of which, if we're talking, say, about infrastructure, the time that that infrastructure is exposed, that asset is exposed. So then we're starting to move into risk again at this point. For all of this, one of the biggest challenges, of course, is then data and evidence. I showed a slide earlier which talks a little bit to some of the evidence that we're starting to generate that puts a story and more information behind multi-hazards and the joined up connections of hazards. We're still often dealing with things in a very singular sense, so we need more and more data and evidence. We've got different ways of defining that. This is from the UNDRR's hazard information profiles, the HIPs, which start to define these. There's work that I'm involved in at the moment, which is bringing multi-hazards into these definitions to, again, define some of those interconnections, but also recognize that with more data and evidence, also then comes, of course, increased complexity. This is from the Gill et al. Paper in 2014 that starts to make those interconnections between hazards real and tangible, but also recognize that also by bringing in that complexity means we are also dealing with more information and more data. So what are we trying to do to address some of these challenges around complex hazards and complex risks? So at this point, I want to note that both the MEDiate project that we're working in, but of course there are many others as well that are also trying to further the science within this area. I'll of course focus a little bit in a second on the MEDiate project, but I very much recognize that, and some of the colleagues here I'm sure are on the call from some of our neighboring projects, either that are finished or that are ongoing. I also recognize things like the Damocles cost action that I'm sure some of us were involved in. That was a lot of the groundwork that has gone into building a community and the science around multi-hazards and compound events. On the side, I just want to have this as a little kind of side piece, which is multi-hazards. We're probably thinking, and I certainly am in this talk, around climate as geological hazards, and especially from a long-term climate change perspective. But there's also another side to this, which is the prediction of multi-hazards. So more of a multi-hazard thinking when it comes to early warnings and forecasting. There's the Medusa project, which is being run at the moment, the early warnings for all initiative, and other things that are also trying to pursue this topic, but from a slightly different perspective. I'm not going to focus on that too much, but I also wanted to have that awareness that there is that forecasting prediction component to the topic that we're looking at here. So the MEDiate project, we had the talk by Abdul Ghani, our project lead, a couple of months ago as part of this webinar series. The MEDiate project is trying to create a risk-based system, which is looking at local and regional disaster risk. We're a project of 18 partners across Europe, built around a series of interconnected, no pun, but interconnected work packages and elements of work. The part that I'm involved in, along with Marcello and others, is the part where we're looking at multi-hazard interactions and the cascading impacts and risks that come from those, working towards the demonstration of some multi-hazard indicators. So within this project, we have tried to build a framework for how these multi-hazards would be assessed and quantified, and leading towards our indicators. So we have this kind of four-step process. The first one is to build our set of definitions. Well, what do we mean by interacting hazards? We use that JISO typology primarily, looking at precondition, multivariate type events, so we can separate our hazards into different types and recognizing that each of them will have differing impacts and different ways of manifesting, I suppose. From that, we then work into connecting those hazards with both modeling and analysis to then output variables that are both joined up, so they're multi-hazard, multivariate or multi-hazard, but could then also then feed into the next step, which for us would then be the risk assessment part. Similarly, then the next step on from there is to look at the cascading impact. So this is of those two parts that I was describing. This is that sort of second part, which is the cascading impact part, and then finally is to then take this forward into both the risk assessment part, but also then quantify it using a series of simple indicators. So I want to focus a little bit on those kind of first couple of steps in this talk, which is around what we've done so far around quantifying multi-hazard interactions. The MEDiate project uses what we call test beds. Like I'm sure, like a lot of projects, we want test cases or test bed areas where we test our ideas and our methods. We are working with local stakeholders in Oslo, Nice, Essex, and Mullathing in Iceland to look at a range of hazards and a range of different types of interacting hazards. So the list here is of 12 different hazard pairings ranging from compound flood and landslide through to snow and avalanche, and then which type that they refer to, whether it's multivariate, triggering, and temporally compounding, and so forth. I'm just going to pick a couple of those examples that we've then worked all the way through. Here for Nice, this is the Nice testbed area. There's a piece of work that we did here to look at the co-occurrence. So this is a multivariate event of heat and drought. So this is comparing those times where it's both hot and dry, leading to potential for drought conditions and how that will change in the future. Now, drought, of course, is in some ways is a relatively easy one because drought is intrinsically linked with heat. More heat is likely to exacerbate drought conditions. But here we went through and produced an output that can then go into our risk assessment and the decision support tool that the MEDiate project is producing to look at near future, middle of the century, and far future, so end of the century, to see how these two events can co-occur, moving away from just thinking about drought or heat as a single event. Similarly then, but now looking at more around storms and the potential for flooding and flash flooding, is to look at combinations of wind and temperature and rainfall. This time we were looking in Essex, and the motivation here was a very recent event, 2022, when we saw significant temperatures, followed by that idea of that notion of heavy rainfall often follows a very dry period. And in this, there's also, of course, fires that also happened in the back of 2022 when this event occurred. So again, here, these combinations of these 2 or 3 variables were looked at to see where, both in the current period, but also into the future, where these co-occurring events are likely to be. And the third example that I just want to pull out is probably, I would say, one of the most complex that we looked at in the MEDiate project, which is heavy rainfall preceding landslides. Now, landslides, of course, are geological, geohazard function, but are driven or are strongly influenced, in this case, by what happens with precipitation and rainfall beforehand. So in this case, these are a preconditioned event. Now, often very location specific, but here the modeling is clearly showing where using a range of scenarios where heavy rainfall is preceding these events and then increasing the likelihood of landslides occurring as we go through and into the future. So we're now taking that information. We're at the stage of the project where we're now doing the risk assessment, following on from those multi-hazard pairings, and then use those to create what we're calling a decision support tool, or multi-platform decision support tool, which is, I think, partly what Abdulghani was speaking about a couple of months or so ago. I'm sure we can add a bit more information to that as we go through. Other projects, though, that relate to this topic, and this is something that was a project that I was working on that finished just last year, which was to take a multi-hazard perspective, so an idea of hazards and risks, but looking quite specifically now in one geographical type of area. In this case, is rural areas. A lot of the focus often in these sort of projects is often urban centres, because that's where the large populations are. But rural locations, rural and remote locations, have their own challenges. In some respects, rural locations may be more resilient and more robust to shocks and events, but actually their coping capacity can reach a threshold and then can be surpassed quite quickly because of where some of these locations are. So in this piece of work, we work with partners in the UK, in Iceland, and in Norway to look at emergent hazards and emergent risks, and particularly from a multi-hazard perspective in some of these regions. And again, we pulled on examples from each of these three countries to say, well, some of these are the unique challenges the remote regions face versus urban. So this is almost overlaying some of the thinking that we've been just presenting, but overlaying it here with in remote locations. One of the most interesting parts, I think, to this project was what is remote and why should multi-hazards affect remote regions specifically. And even just the simple thing of actually remote means something quite different in the three countries that we're working across, which highlights to me the need for simplicity and good and clear communication. I think there was a response that said in Norway, well, most of Norway is remote, so we don't really have a definition for remote. Whereas in other countries, in Scotland, which is the area we're working on in the UK, there's a clear definition, same for Iceland. And in this particular case, I'll just pull out one example here. We were looking at multivariate events. And again, we had that focus on multi-hazard, yes, but also more emergent risks. And what I mean by that is risks that you perhaps wouldn't have necessarily thought of as being a particular challenge now, but actually are an increasing challenge and will become more so in the future. So in this case, we were looking at hot and dry days in Scotland. Most people that know Scotland won't think of Scotland as being hot and dry, but increasingly we're seeing events where temperatures are increasing, longer dry spells, longer dry spells in between, the likelihood of fires in rural locations, crop failure, and indeed water scarcity challenges. So we've highlighted a lot of multi-hazard challenges, both in all three of these countries. And this is just one of those examples here. And that's already now starting to feed through into SEPA's work. SEPA is the Scottish Environment Protection Agency, Scottish Government, to both improve the water scarcity alerts, but also then working towards multi-hazard early warning services. Again, this is a bit of a nod to the forecasting component. So I want to kind of round off many of these sort of elements that I've been speaking about here with, I'm going to suggest some priorities, some suggested priorities for where I think as a broad, and again, by definition, a very complex topic, perhaps needs to go, both on the knowledge that we have from existing initiatives, but also some of the work that we're doing across many of the projects some of which I've highlighted here. For me, I think one of the biggest priorities should be reducing the terminology and simplifying it. There are so many terms that we are using, and we're all often using in different ways to mean often the same thing. Words like interacting, complex, interconnections, interdependencies are all often used to mean the same thing. But having those two clear separation between whether we're talking about interconnected hazards or whether we're talking about interconnected risks or cascading risks are two fundamentally different things, because one is more of a natural process. One, of course, is related to vulnerabilities, exposure, and our man-made networks and systems. So maybe having terms that are unique one side or the other, perhaps under an overarching term, let's just say complex risk, because it's a good catch-all term. But I think there needs to be clearer definitions, and maybe it should be the likes of IPCC and AR7 that tries to clarify. The next one, perhaps, is a bit UK specific, but not completely. It translates everywhere. In the next UK climate risk assessment, which I'm involved in a bit as we spin up for the next 2 years, is to adopt, again, a clear set of definitions. And again, this can be expanded to any climate risk assessment or natural hazard risk assessment, is be clear around definitions and then stick with them. Again, maybe adopting more of a high level set of definitions, perhaps from the IPCC or other. Then we go more into perhaps the management side of things. A lot of the focus that I've given in this talk is around quantification and perhaps the research, the more sort of analytical, theoretical side of things. But I think it's really important to also then connect these interconnected hazards and risks into risk ownership. Who owns that risk? And again, I'll use the UK as an example, where following the previous risk assessment, CCRA3 in the UK government is then was then provided with a list of risks, priority risks, and they're coloured. You can't read them, but they're on the image you can see on the screen here. 61 risks. Each of those is then allotted, in effect, to a different government department. Some, of course, government departments have more than one, but effectively there's risk ownership that gets passed to a particular government to either address and move forward. But of course, that approach means almost then, as a byproduct, is they become somewhat siloed in how those risks are being adopted, which is counter to more of a systems thinking approach, which is quite rightly being encouraged by the risk assessment process. So we've kind of got this kind of mix of ownership versus practicalities, I suppose, around risk ownership. So there needs to be some work done there in who owns risk, but also who owns the joined up risk, who owns that interconnection. The next point then, again, still talking perhaps about management, but now more about risk management in the broader sense, which is how can interacting and cascading risk or complex risk, again, depending on which term we want to use, how do we bring that into adaptation? I would say the adaptation journey for multi-hazards interacting risk is probably somewhat early on in the timescale. I think a lot of the work so far has been more around the analytical and understanding and the frameworks in which to analyze, less so actually about how do we adapt and build resilience to them. So I think there's a lot of work to be done here, perhaps in particular around thinking back to the Cape Town example of worst case scenario planning and the unforeseen events, black swan events, what we don't know is can happen, or things that we wouldn't have once perceived could happen that may happen in the future. I don't think that has really come into the mainstream yet. One of the earlier things that I mentioned, of course, that would support a lot of the activities that I'm suggesting, or perhaps suggesting as a priority, is around data and evidence. we are a long way away, I think, from being able to systematically record our events in a joined up, interconnected way. I used the example of MEDiate earlier. MEDiate, of course, is just single hazard. There are ways you can draw information out of it that are more multi-hazard in flavor, but that is not done systematically or consistently. And I think the same then happens perhaps at country level or regional level, where the databases are still siloed, sectoral, and piecemeal. And there's a lot of people interested, and a lot of people want to create these databases, but at this stage we are not there. So I would hope over the next years and decades that becomes more mainstream. And then the last one on this screen is around how do we, if we can quantify these multi-hazard risks and cascading risks better, is how do we record them? How do we quantify them? How do we record them? How do we track them over time? And if you look to many of our indicators that we currently use, let's say our climate risk indicators, they often, and I think almost wholesale, are single in focus, single hazard, single variable, a single risk. There's very little out there that really looks at the real world, the system thinking type of indicators. And that's a bit of a nod to the talk that Marcello is going to give, that's going to follow on from me, which is trying to address and trying to forward that. And then the last thing that I want to just say on this around a potential priority area, I think, is around the communication. I started right at the beginning with definitions and the complexity of those definitions. But I think we need to also then try and take out some of the complexity of those and maybe look at alternatives as to how we both quantify, but most importantly, how we communicate and who communicates those different approaches. I'm an engineer by background. I sit in an engineering department, but most of the work that I do is very climate science. I think, for example, engineers have a key role to play in taking climate information, but also making it relatable to real world applications, especially when we're thinking of critical infrastructure. But there's other approaches that's more around the communicators. There are approaches that are more around narratives, for example. So not just the quantified numerical approaches, but also storylines, storytelling, and narratives that will help us equip our future generations for understanding systems thinking and how that relates to the topic that we're talking about here, those multi-hazards and multi-risks. So I'll just end with a couple of quick conclusions, which is I think we're at the stage where we can say that under this umbrella term, let's say, of complex risk, there are two components, there are two sides, and I think it may be helpful if we have those clearer definitions and then adopt universal definitions for all of them, maybe under, say, like I said, some umbrella term that connects these two. Of the two sides, I would say anecdotally, and I think this is probably fair to say, that there's a lot more work that's ongoing at the moment in the multi-hazard, the interacting hazard space, and probably a little bit less in the cascading risk space. There are some brilliant examples out there, but there's more work to be done in both of these areas. But I would say there's more in the literature around multi-hazards than there is around cascading risks. Aligned with this, I think we need to see evidence and monitoring, and then really that needs to then filter down into risk management, risk ownership, disaster risk recovery, and so on. So I'll leave it there. Thank you very much for listening. I think we're going to have some questions afterwards. So at this point, I'm just going to hand straight over to Marcello, who will follow on from here. We're talking about multi-hazard indicators. For those just to finish off, there's a link here to one of the papers I showed earlier, which was doing the quantification of multi-hazard risks. I'm happy to share, of course, links we'll have you afterwards and a link to the project. Okay, thanks for your time and attention. I'm going to stop sharing, and Marcello, over to you.
Thank you very much, Chris. Thanks a lot. Just give me a few seconds to share the screen. Thanks really for your presentation and for making the bridge to my section. I think that, can you confirm that you see my slides? Well,
Yes.
so
Yeah.
welcome everyone, and good day. As Chris said, we don't know if you which side of the world are you. So if it's night or morning, so just good day. It's as at the beginning they introduced me. I'm Marcello Rosio. I'm an assistant professor at the Youth University in Pavia. And after the presentation that we just saw from Chris about how much is complex the multi-hazard and risk world, I would like to focus now in the next 30 minutes about one specific aspect, that is the develop and the use of indicators. And in order to do that, I will try to follow this list of main topics. So first of all, I think, as Chris mentioned, it's important that we all agree and we are on the same page when we are referring to what is an indicator. And then actually the next immediately phase is to understand why we need indicator. I think that was clear enough from the Chris presentation how complex is this phenomenon, and I can anticipate that probably one of the major reason why we need indicators is try to make simple this complex phenomenon. And then as within this series, we are here also to bring our experience from MEDiate project. I will show the methods that we develop and apply to develop a new multi-hazard indicators. And we came out with 3 ideas of possible multi-hazard indicators. And then actually we apply those new idea in the test bed that we saw in the previous presentation. And I would like to use this example in order to show how we can adopt this multi-hazard indicator in a real context. And then I will try to conclude my presentation with some food for thought that would like just some ideas to let us discuss together about these topics. So starting from what is an indicator. So I bring here a definition that I'm going to read it, and then we can discuss about it. So an indicator is an observable and measurable characteristics that can be used to simplify information, to help understand the state of concept or phenomena, and or to monitor over time to show change or progress toward achieving a specific change. As you see, this is a definition that we take from JIT 2022 and even each 2019 that and which we belong to, and then I underline some few of words that are within this definition that I think are key words that we need to keep in mind when we are talking about indicator. First word is simplify. So we need, when we're talking indicator, we are talking something that it's simple, that can be easily communicated, and it's simple in a way that can provide information in order to help to understand. So we know that this is a complex phenomena, but if we want to deal with it, we need to understand first of all. And then above on that, so after that we understand, another very important aspect that we use indicator for is to monitoring something. So first of all, it's to monitoring usually across time, so passing usually year by year, and monitor what we want actually to monitor. We want to monitor some change or progress. It's not, any change can be positive or negative. In this definition, we don't have a specific negative component. It's changing that can be positive or negative within a specific target that we want to achieve and that we want to observe. Let's say that we want to see how temperature is changing because we want to adapt to that, or because we want to mitigate the consequence. So are those all of the indicators that are used from different stakeholders in order to better reply to this new stage of changing that there is phase by phase. So here I bring some example that are coming from what actually indicators are in when we are talking a single hazard, traditional single hazard environment. So here we can look at the climate indicator presented by Copernicus to show long-term trend in the key climatic variables. So here I bring this example because this is what the state of the art that already been used from many different stakeholders. In this case, are the EU main stakeholders that are looking and monitoring how temperature is changing. And we can see globally or across Europe or across a specific area like Antarctic. We can not only use indicator for environmental and variable, but also from more human-made variable like other aspects like carbon dioxide concentration and so on. And as you see, these are quite simple indicators, just single numbers with a sign that can be plus or minus, and that give you a trend respect to a reference period that usually is done. It's a simple conclusion number, but behind that there are many assumptions and many definition that are already taken in order to make the final result quite simple. And this is exactly what we are looking for. We need in the multi-hazard context, and from the Chris presentation we saw why we need it. Now we need to propose something simple like this, but also for not only for a single hazard, but more for a multi-hazard. This is another example from the UK context, and this is a bit different because compared to the previous one where there was only a single numbers, this is a different type of indicator. It's first of all, it's categorized, so we have a different level. We have 4, let's say, qualitative level from very low to high. For each of them, there has been assigned a specific threshold of maximum day temperature and night time temperature. This combination is related to the type of increase in mortality above expectant level. And this is a quite simple level, so you just need to monitor those 2 variables, and you know which type of level you can expect it. So it's from very low to very high. And of course, this is the conclusion of many assumptions, many computation that has been implemented below, but the final level and representation, it's quite easy and quite understandable. Another example worldwide is definitely the icon that the IPCC proposed, and I guess that most of us are familiar with. Here we can see another aspect that has been introduced in this type of representation of indicator is the level of confidence that we have. So if we are medium confidence, if it's likely, very likely, or virtual certain. So it's a kind of express how those phenomena we are confident with that. And of course, each of them is associated a specific icon that can immediately represent and communicate the specific phenomena that they are looking and they are considering. So these examples are examples starting from the state of art in the context of single hazard. Now, why we need a multi-hazard indicator? First of all, what we've done is we already saw this presentation from Chris. This is the framework that we adopt in MEDiate. In particular, the topic that I'm talking now is relating step 4. And why we need step 4? We need the step 4 because, as you can see, step 1, 2, and 3 are proposing a very high level of complexity, different type of interaction, different type of temporal, spatial, cascading, different type of definition, many different variables and intensity measure that each of them are associated. Most of those variables usually are not familiar to the typical stakeholder that need to take decision in our societies. So we need to find a way how we can summarize all of these in a simple final value that we can adopt and use to communicate, to make simple, to understand, to monitoring a trend and achieve our goal. So that's the reason, but why we need to develop it? Because at the moment, in our scientific community, there is a strong lack on an indicator that can represent those. We saw before in the previous slides that exist indicators that express very well single hazard, and there are hundreds of those indicators for each single hazard. We cannot say, unfortunately, the same for the multi-hazard. So we really need, from a scientific perspective, to develop and expand this knowledge. In order to affirm this, with our colleagues in MEDiate and also with the other European project, we did a systematic literature review where we start to investigate more than 1,000 papers. We go down to reading very carefully almost 200 papers, articles, scientific articles, and we, first of all, articles that are mentioning that are using multi-hazard indicators. So those were scientific papers that we really want to read and understand what's the state of art in our scientific community talking about multi-hazard indicators. So first of all, we realized that across all of those papers, there were like 24 that actually were not talking about hazard at all, and only 170 were talking about hazard. But this can be still quite good news if we can say that there are 170 papers talking about hazard assessment in the context of multi-hazard indicator. We cannot say the same if when we talk about vulnerability. As you can see, the number of papers that are doing hazard and vulnerability at the same time and multi-hazard indicators are much less, are less than half of those that were considering hazards. And then this is decreasing again if we're talking about papers that are doing all the chain of risk assessment, starting from hazard, analyzing vulnerability, and going to risk and impact. As you can see, almost about only 60 papers across the 200 were investigating multi-hazard indicator up to the risk and impact assessment. This is coming back to one of the comments that Chris concluded before, where like that at the moment there are much more works on the hazard component compared to the vulnerability and risk analysis. But then if we come to more in detail and we want to investigate which type of hazard categories has been investigated, we can see that the majority of those hazards are meteorological and hydrogeological. Then the next one is geohazard, and going down to fewer environmental and technological phenomena. And then if we want to investigate how those hazard categories are studied at the same time as a multi-hazard relation, we actually discover that half of them are not what we call real the multi-hazard in the term that there is a real interaction, but are more like multi-layer single hazard. What does it mean? That those analyses were assessing hazards independently one by one, and then overlay the results at the end without studying really the connection and any type of interaction between them. So most of the work at the moment that do multi-hazard, it's really limited to a multi-layer single. And only if we take out those multi-layer single, we come to what are the compound, so the temporal or spatial compound, and actually those triggering and amplification. Those are the works that actually are investigating those real interaction between multi-hazard. In this context, those paper actually, these numbers are not numbers of papers, but those are numbers of hazard interaction. And the paper that are doing that one are lower. There are very interesting indicator proposed that, but as you can see from a broader perspective, particularly compared to the single hazard, are much, much lower. Exactly. This is, so the blue one is the multi-layer single, that blue arrow underline the one that I was just mentioning. So no interaction between the hazard that has been investigated, and instead the red one are the one that actually consider interaction, any type of interaction that we can even imagine. Then, if we want to take the two type of hazard interactions, so compound and triggering amplification, we investigate and try to categorize what are the type of multi-hazard indicator that has been adopted. And those, as you can see, there are different types from frequency to probability, composite indicators, and belong to these categories. There are different good examples that from the literature we can start to have a look. Those plots, as you can see in these slides, I invite you to are not available for copying and reproduction because are results that are under review right at the moment. So coming back to the project MEDiate, we see that starting from this literature review, we develop a methods in order to propose new multi-hazard indicators that can respect some future that we underline the project. So the methods or the approach that we adopt have different objectives and different steps that we can characterize mainly in three parts. So the literature review that I just showed, then across the project, we were able to engage the stakeholder in our 4 test beds and collect from them the type of feedbacks that were crucial in order to develop our indicators, not ours, but to develop a multi-hazard indicator that can be applied, because since the indicator need to be easy and usable and need to help the stakeholders, of course, this phase becomes crucial in this phase. On the other side, there is a very important aspect that is the data constraints, so the data availability, because one of the challenge that we face is that it's true that we want to apply this multi-hazard indicator in our test bed in our project, but at the same time, this type of indicator need to be replicated in many other places. Let's say as an European project need to be applied at least across Europe. In this sense, we need to think to develop an indicator that can be applied across all Europe in terms of data availability, for example. So, and coming after this mix of these 3 points, so the point of what exists in state of art of literature. Second point, what's the stakeholder ask that we develop? And the third point, what actually are the data available that we can use in order to develop the indicators? We come with these 3 ideas. So at least 3 types of multi-hazard indicator. First of all, is the frequency trend. So a graphical representation of the past and future trends of multi-hazard concurrence frequency. So in these ideas, we want to represent the co-occurrence in terms of frequency and show clearly how with the just one trends, which type of trend is following that type of co-occurrence. Second one instead is probability change. So this quantify if it's increasing or decreasing the joint return period of a multi-hazard. So in this sense, we are focusing on a joint return period, so not the single return period of single events, but we're looking the joint of them, and we want to monitor if it's increasing or decreasing, comparing different period. And then finally, the previous 2 frequency and probability are point-wise. So we are adopting time series that are specific in some location. And in this case, we are not able to distribute the information across space. So we need a third indicator that actually is advocate for that. So it's advocate for distribute this spatial information. So it's provide information on spatial distribution of co-occurrence of multi-hazard. So let's have a look, some example of those applications. So start with the frequency trend. So starting with the application in Oslo, and we look at compound river and coastal flood. In this plot, we plot from 1970 to these years, number of events, co-occurrence of those two events. And in particular, number of co-occurrence events, and we see the frequency of those events. We did the same in NIS. In this case, it's the temporal compound heat waves and drought, starting from the 1970 to using also not only historical data, but also future projection. And we can see that in that sense, the number of events of compound co-occurrence heat waves and drought along the end of the century is going to increase in terms of observing number of events. Vice versa, when we are talking about the probability change indicator, we are talking about the percentage of probability change of joint return period. In this sense, is a clear sign that tell you if the joint probability in terms of percentage in the two-time reference period is increasing or decreasing. And this allows you to understand if those events are more probable or less probable. It's an easy way to measure it. As I mentioned, the previous two examples are referring to point-wise. So we pick some specific location and we take the time series and we analyze that one. Vice versa, the third one, we keep the example of NIS, the temporal compound heat waves and drought, and we can generate maps. This means that we can not only make the difference between left and right, between historical and far future projection, but we can also, within the same time period, also see which location is exposed to an increase of more compound events. In that sense, spatial distribution allowed this aspect, what actually was not possible. The only difference here is that for some type of hazard, we have a spatial distribution information. For other, we don't. Like in the case of river and coastal flood, in order to compute the frequency and the probability, we adopt like the time series of discharge or storm of water that were like recorded in some specific point. So we adopt that point in order to estimate the value, but we couldn't able to make those information available across different locations. And that was the reason why in some time it's not possible to make a spatial representation. Vice versa, in case of NIS, we use climate variable and also reanalysis that allow to have more information in a grid space, and these allow actually to represent this spatial distribution. So going to the end, I want to stress some points that I hope that can facilitate the question discussion that we can discuss all together after the end of this presentation. So first of all, one of the points that both Chris and I highlight in our presentation was data availability discrepancy among hazards pose challenge for multi-hazard integration. Because what's this point raised? It's the main difference between when we study single hazard versus multi-hazard is that if you study a single hazard, you do all the best that you can do with that specific hazard in that location. Vice versa, when you do a multi-hazard, you are dealing with more than one hazard, and that actually sometimes those hazards can be very, very different from them in terms of hazard intensity variable, in terms of frequency, in terms of type of data that are used in order to monitor it. And so to deal with these differences and discrepancy, actually, it's one of the main challenges in order to to do a multi-hazard analysis. And then, of course, there is an issue of data availability varies by regions. So the fact that, as I mentioned at the beginning, we want to propose something that can be done everywhere. And the 3 ideas doesn't mean that in any place for any multi-hazard combination that you are considering, you are able to use all of them. The important thing is that at least one of those it's feasible with the data that you have. That's the advantage of proposing different type of multi-hazard indicators. And then the same issue that we have from a space perspective, we have also from a temporal perspective. So, as you probably already saw from the representation of my plots, already passing from our test bed, there are always the same time period reference. And this is due only to the reason that in some place you have historical records that go much further, or you have for specific hazard, you have much more information on climate projection, so you can do more accurate climate future projection. And this actually, it's really one of the challenges that you need to face when you are dealing with multi-hazard. I hope that the presentation was clear enough, but for sure, I'm and probably Chris as well will be much more than available to reply questions and any type of doubts. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Marcelo. Thank you, Chris. The presentations were very included a lot of details, and they were very interesting. So thanks for sharing that knowledge. I see that we have some questions in the Q&A section. Chris, I saw that you want to answer some of those directly. I can see that 3 people have raised their hands. So if you agree, Chris, you can answer the questions in the Q&A, and then we can open the mic for those who want to ask the questions in live.
Yeah, sure, thanks. And I sort of selected your answer live, and Marcello, if you want to answer any of the subsequent ones that I've clicked on, will answer, please do hand up and jump in. But I'll answer the first couple there that I think, well, one of them actually is Bazir, who's also got their hand up. So hopefully that will address the Q&A question. It's the same one for the hand up, which is around physical vulnerability, or how we effectively, I think the question is asking, how do we connect 2 quite different hazards into one particular output? And I would say in the MEDiate project, this was probably one of the greatest challenges that we faced for when we had 2 different hazards and needing to get it to one number or one variable or one metric. And I think the answer sits somewhere actually between both some of the work that I presented and also what Marcello was presenting there around indicators, which is in some cases, the hazards lended themselves, I think, quite easily to producing a simple probability of occurrence and the same sort of metric or number, or 2 separate ones. So drought and heat, for example, is the common metric of that is just how many days something occurred, because it's about co-occurrence. The more challenging ones, that Muller thing example that I used there for Iceland, is about preconditioning of rainfall events followed by landslides. That can't be brought down into one number because it's around a sequencing of events and things that need to happen before the actual event, as well as, of course, you've got to be in a landslide susceptible area, a low risk area. So for those, we're not able to get to, let's say, a fragility curve or something simple. In those cases, we're more reliant then on the messaging and the more qualitative type of approaches, which are around using narratives or case studies or descriptions to describe the sequencing of events, that if rainfall is going to, take the landslide, so if rainfall is going to occur, heavy rainfall, and it's going to fall in an area where there's known to be landslide susceptible, then the connection from a single to a multi-hazard is saying this is the sequence, this is the process, as opposed to there's a risk of a landslide. So it's more around the messaging and the communication, which is why I sort of connected at the end of my talk to that piece around improved communication around this, that sometimes it's not actually about boiling everything down to a particular number. I think we found in this project, it's actually around clear communication as much as anything. And part of that, I think part of that solution is around things like simplified indicators, as Marcello was talking about. So the answer to that simply is, in some cases we could do a more traditional approach and get one number. In other cases, we found very much that wasn't the case. So I hope that answers that that first question.
Yeah, probably I can follow with one, Chris, and then in the
Sure.
meantime you look for another one. So I saw that the Habas was asking for regarding multi-hazard indicator. In particular, it was interesting on the experience that we had in MEDiate regarding the stakeholder engagement and elicitation. So you want to listen from us some insight that we can share, and actually, thanks with the works of our colleagues and Yonghua that helps a lot on this phase, we can share some of the experience that we got. And first of all, the compatibility, they were asking that those indicators need to be compatible with existing systems. So this is it's something that as a scientific as a faculty, as a scientific community, we actually cannot do it. So that's one of the type of reason that we need to have this type of dialogue. We need to know what existing systems are looking for, both from a normative, but not only. And then they need to fit for purpose. So those indicators really need to be applicable in that specific circumstance. And then another aspect that we could expect, and that we both Chris and I stress, I think, quite a lot today, they really ask for some indicator that were the comprehensibility and accessibility of those information. So something that can be very useful, and that even today when I was giving the presentation, I was looking this indicator of probability with just an arrow moving left and right. Seems to me quite simple, but this is the type of things that they were stressing and asking for the indicator. So need to be applicable, need to respect the existing systems, and need to be very understandable and usable. That's, I think, are the main conclusion that we can share in main insight.
Good stuff, Marcello. If I can, I'll go, I think, right back to the top of the Q&A, because there were some questions from really early on. And there were two there, which I might try and combine a bit. So there's the one from Odessa and the one from Vlatko, which sort of talk to a similar point. So the first one is around knowledge dissemination and what can academic institutions do, which is a really good question. And then there's one around the knowledge creation by these sorts of projects, like the MEDiate project, and their impact on things like policy. So I can probably sort of talk a little bit to those two together. I think academic institutions obviously retain a lot of good knowledge, good skill, good expertise, of course, in these areas. But one thing we were very conscious of with the MEDiate project is making and keeping this as a real world project. And we're not distinct in that. A lot of the projects, of course, take this approach, which is to work with real people, real challenges, real cities, real locations, and involving and engaging with them as we go through. So whilst as an academic, our outputs are often academic in nature, papers, technical reports, actually a lot of the work is the unseen part, which is actually a lot of it is around dialogue and discussion and getting to a particular point. I would say in the MEDiate project, probably the first year or more of it, and the same actually in the Emerge project, the other one that I discussed, is we probably spent half of those two projects to date just talking around definitions and getting on the same page and understanding each other. Even that word of fragility curves and connecting two hazards together to be one number. Everyone was coming at those sort of challenges from different perspectives. So I think academia has, and it's not, again, just academics, but academia has a role to play in finding that middle ground, but also, and speaking personally, is I want to do research that is real and connected to people, and therefore can make hopefully some kind of tangible difference. And I think that's what we're trying to achieve here in MEDiate. The other thing I would just add on, which talks a little bit more to the second point, which is around policy making. And I think I could probably speak to the MEDiate project here. So the key output for us is a tool, yes, a decision support tool that hopefully will then continue to grow and expand beyond the length of the project. But in terms of how we influence policy, it's getting information, whether it's clear messaging, whether it's data, evidence, into the mainstream, but also then converting that to tangible, real world problems and challenges and solutions, of course. Is taking it one step further than what we do. So yes, again, it's about academic output, but it's then turning that into something real and tangible. So I think academia across the piece and the projects have a key role to take in that. As for where these projects go, is there a central resource that's going to compile all of this? Possibly, maybe. I think it's a little beyond the scope of what I can probably answer to. But yes, there are plans for central repositories, wikis, that kind of thing that will retain all of this information. I hope that sort of addresses those first 2 points.
Yeah, thanks. I can fully agree on this, and I will take a very interesting question about from Harikisha that she was asking. A significant part of the economical losses are due to infrastructure failure, and then asking about how such infrastructure failure is need to improve and update existing standard codes. What are relevant steps that we should be considered to address this? So this question, I think it's quite relevant, and my suggestion when we need to deal with this, it's first of all, I think we need to make a distinction between infrastructure that are designed to mitigate hazard like levies or retrofitting solution for buildings. So those type of infrastructure that actually are helping to mitigate, are designed to mitigate, versus to those infrastructure that actually provide service and they are exposed, like electric networks or road networks that are infrastructure itself, but they provide service. Their mandate is not to protect by hazard. So for the first category of, I think that the main suggestion is taking consideration the joint probability of event will be a step forward, quite relevant. So not considering only the probability of single events, but considering the probability of the design probability of a multi-hazard can, because, and the reason is that as one of the paper that actually Chris was showing in his slide is that the impact of multi-hazard are much higher. So we need to protect from those multi-hazard events because we want to reduce those amount of impact. So, and if we want to be effective in our mitigation, we need to consider multi-hazard in our infrastructure designing. Another aspect instead that I think it's quite interesting for this type of design infrastructure as an engineer, I think that at the moment, any law that I know are considering as force for designing the hazard itself. They're not considering the risk. So they're not considering the benefit that those mitigation infrastructure bring to the society. So they're design versus the hazard. They are not designing for the benefit versus the benefit that they bring to the society. And this, I think, it's an important step forward that we should push as a scientific community to our society. So we really need to think designing, having in mind the risk, the benefits. And I'm coming from a flood world, and so designing a levee versus a 200 return period, or designing a levee versus a reduction of risk of 1,000 million of less losses per year. And I think this is an important paradigm shift that I would stress as a suggestion for future research and dialogue with the institution. I don't know if I replying part of the question.
Thanks. I think so much. Oh, yeah. I think the couple of questions that I'd like to have a quick go at are sort of the middle couple of questions in there, which relate to methods, I think, around dependence, statistical dependence, and what we did. So in MEDiate, we used a joint probability approach using copulars, and that was I think sufficient for most of the hazard pairings that we looked at. I think the biggest challenge we had, though, was, and again, this has a specific, biggest challenge probably was around those infrequently occurring hazards that are very site specific, and landslides, I think, is a really good example of that, where we're connecting two fundamentally different processes. So in conclusion, I think having gone through this process in the MEDiate project, very ambitiously trying to cover quite a wide range of hazards, is realizing that not one method, there is no one method that can satisfy all. There is no magic method or model that we can use. So I think for us, we stuck with joint probability, statistical dependence, but of course that's heavily reliant on long time series, co-occurring time series of two variables. Where we didn't have that, then, like I said, we tended to switch to the more either existing information, adding information together qualitatively, and then making sort of expert judgment around co-occurrence. So it's difficult to say. In some ways, this method could be applied to all, but certainly we used almost, I suppose, a scaled and an appropriate approach for each of those.
I don't know if there was some. Yeah.
Go on, please.
No, I was just asking if there was someone raising hands that want to raise question or.
Yeah, maybe that's a good idea. We have Santiago Tawal. Do you want to ask your question live?
Hello, I don't know if can you hear me?
Yep.
Yeah.
Please go ahead.
Thank you.
Yeah, I just had a question regarding if there was an indicator that combined both the multi-hazards with the cascading impact. So the interdependency of the natural hazard with the effect on the critical infrastructure. If there's any research being done, any indicator that is attempting to quantify these two type of events.
Yeah, I can go, Chris, or
yeah, go for it.
Yeah, and thanks, Santiago, for the question. As one of the first plot that I show, so in the scientific literature, there are much less work that are considering the full chain of risk. So starting from the multi-hazard, going to the impact in terms of any type of impact, from direct to cascading impact. And as much as you go to the indirect, so to the cascading, the indicator are lower and lower. So in our work, we were focusing at the moment on the multi-hazard indicator. So we were focusing on the indicator studying the multi-hazard interaction. Of course, the interest is moving forward and considering as well the exposure and vulnerability of different systems exposed to the hazard. But at the moment, we developed so far the multi-hazard indicators, and there are few works doing indicator multi-hazard or multi-hazard indicator and cascading effect. And the reason is because as soon as you bring in the discussion, you bring the exposure, then it really depends on which type of exposure you are interested in. So if the cascading is regarding some specific system like a electrical system, or you are more interested on health system or in the school systems. So according to the different type of exposure that you are more interested, there are some example, not many actually. And I think that one of the key message that we want to stress in the paper that was mentioned before, and actually today as well, it's really the need of working on more on the risk side and not only on the hazard side. We know that the multi-hazard is already complex, but it's probably even more when we're talking about the cascading, considering the exposure and vulnerability. So yeah, this is my reply, Santiago. I'm sorry that it's not fully reply, you know, but that's my knowledge to that point, and I don't think there is much at the moment, and it's good opportunity for actually doing more research on this topic, I think. I don't know if Chris, you have a different opinion or.
No, I think good. Thanks. I was just trying to select I suppose a question here for the next one. There's a question here from Camilo, I think, which is around, are we planning to integrate the two sort of components? I assume by the two components you mean the multi-hazard interacting part and the cascading risk part, and I'm assuming into indicators. So that's again, that sort of relates to the point that I think Marcello was just talking about there, which is we're focused a bit primarily on the multi-hazard part in the indicator work, that is, not how that then propagates into risk and cascading risk. Storylines, though, I agree, is a really key area, I think, to cover and connect both of these areas, which is, and by storylines, I assume you do mean sort of statistical storylines as opposed to storytelling, two quite sort of different approaches. I think both of them actually have an opportunity and a potential here. But in terms of indicators, yeah, we're sticking probably within the scope of the project anyway around multi-hazards. However, if you want to know a little bit more about some of the work that we've done in the risk side, so the vulnerability exposure components of the project that will also feed into the decision support tool that we're doing, that's going to be coming up in this series of webinars that we're doing for the UNESCO chair. I don't know, Raphael, whether we have dates for those yet, or whether it's something you maybe are going to mention at the end. But there's a series of these types of events over the next weeks and months, which will kind of hopefully add a bit more information to it after that. So I hope that half addresses that question. But the sentiment in there, which is, yeah, can storylines, can other approaches help with indicators? Absolutely. And I think we're looking, again, not in isolation, but bringing a lot of these components together.
Okay, I'm reading a question from Camilo Gomez that is saying, are you planning to integrate these two dynamically changing components, time-dependent socioeconomic variable, time and state-dependent physical exposure, to propose a multi-hazard risk indicator to specific timeline? Do you think these storylines yeah, I mean, on the top of the storylines that Chris was mentioning, I mean, I think the storyline definitely it's an option, because if we go more from let's say a more physical risk traditional approach, where you have your exposure that it's fixed in time, like buildings, that usually most of the time buildings are fixed across years. Instead, when you talk about crops, it's much more variable, season by season, year by year. And the main challenge to use the traditional approach is that we have no data that can represent those variability in time. So probably in some few test bed, in few cases, you can apply it, and but it's very difficult to make scalable to a larger area due to the lack of data. And another aspect when we talk about dynamicity is that we are I don't know if there are no data or the data are not available or are very expensive, but for sure the information on the connection, the flow between different, so let's say when we talk about systems, the flow or let's say transports, and so it's not just a matter of information on the element that are exposed, but also the information on the flow between the elements. And those type of data are becoming quite relevant in the last few years compared to the information of fixed asset that starting to be important since the 90s. So database has been built on that according to the new requirements. So I think that in the next few years, new database will come as well for the this new data. And according to the new data, new methods will appear. At the moment, I think it's quite challenging, and Storyline is a good alternative for that.
Marcelo, thank you, Chris. Let's give the word to Sarah Vine. Sarah, if you want to ask your question, please go ahead.
I cannot hear her. It's just me or
No, I think that's something with Sarah's mic. Sarah, can you hear us? Sarah, I think that maybe she's having some problem with the audio.
Should we come back to Sarah?
Yep. And
Okay.
Sarah, if you want to add the question in the Q&A, Chris and Marcelo will answer. Is there, Chris, any other question that we need to address?
Yeah, there's a couple in there which might have a quick response to. Try and keep aware of time, and probably need to wrap this up fairly shortly, but I'll try and answer a couple if I can. So there's one there from Ode around assumptions and judgment being made in the analysis, which is a good question. So this talks to, I think, one of the questions that were answered earlier on, which is around sensitivity, simply in the analysis. And in each case, the uncertainties were quantified within the joint probability process. But of course, we're very reliant on both the observational data that we get as well as the climate projections. I would say it's an area of work that we're still working on, which is how does that uncertainty then propagate through the various components of a multi-hazard analysis. And what we did, because we weren't using one particular model, we were using a range of different approaches. Therefore, the uncertainties attached to them and the sensitivity, therefore, of any of those decisions made within them are going to be wide-ranging, I suppose. But for those that where we use expert judgment, at that point, we are, of course, completely reliant upon the knowledge that we have to date and the expertise that exists through our testbed and through our partners. I would say it's somewhat difficult to then come up with a complete sensitivity answer. There's a couple of other questions there around the last one as an anonymous one, but is around the time period for hazards being analyzed. Yes, we use the same as best we could anyway, the same historical period, and definitely the same future projection periods using climate models if we were looking at climate projections. The tricky part, of course, with that is not all hazards are represented well within climate projections, but it's about abstracting the key variables that enable us to make those projections. But yes, I think it's quite essential, especially when you're doing a piece of work as large as, say, the MEDiate project is, where you're looking across different hazards to at least have some uniformity with timescales and timeframes. Again, I would just point out, though, that probably one of the biggest challenges we had was around those very site-specific, regional types of hazards, where the record is both either piecemeal or not very long, compared to others where you can still look at a long climatological record and still extract the information. Two very different types of hazards to deal with, them two completely different data sets. I hope that sort of helps address that point. The last one, which I'll just quickly touch on, which is again another anonymous one. So I don't know who asked. I'm afraid I couldn't really quite follow that first bit, whether it's a question or a statement. But the second part is around the flywheel diagram from Simpson. That the focus of the paper was adding on the fourth pin. Absolutely right, it was. But the reason for me referencing that paper was around the terminology and the definitions that were being presented, and the analysis, the review of those definitions, which was kind of the point that I was making earlier. To answer the question of, are we going to be looking at capacity in the MEDiate project? I think the answer to that is probably yes and no. We're not looking at capacity directly, but by building and creating or co-creating a decision support tool with our test beds, what we're trying to do is have a tool that would enable our stakeholders, our partners, to be able to make more and better informed decisions. Within part of that process, therefore, is capacity and capability to be able to respond. That's where I think the decision support tool will come in. And again, I can perhaps refer forward to one of the presentations that hopefully will occur within this series. So I hope that, in part at least, answers that question.
Thank you very much, Chris. Thank you, Marcelo. Dina is connected. I don't know, Dina, if you want to say some closing remarks.
Thank you very much, Rafael, for coordinating and presenting and moderating this session, and Chris and Marcello, thank you very much for presenting the MEDiate hazards or multi-hazards approach to risk. As Chris has reiterated, it is the case that this is only the first step. And I agree with many of the comments that, yes, we also need the exposure and vulnerability in the equations. Otherwise, we cannot really compute risks in a relevant manner. And then we need to look at capacity and capability to respond to those risks. But we hope that we have really whet your appetite with these first presentations, and there will be a second one probably in November, and then another one in January that hopefully will help closing, and in fact one more than in March, which will help closing the loop. So keep looking at our website and keep answering to our invitations if you want to know how the story ends. And thank you very much for attending and for the very relevant question. I think the question and answer is always the bit where we really enjoy the interaction. If there are no other questions, then we will, I think, Rafael, you had already introduced the next seminar, but maybe you want to remind the audience when and what it will entail.
Yes, Dina, thank you. As I mentioned at the beginning, we will have another seminar by the end of another webinar by the end of October with Professor Dongping Fang from Tsinghua University and Professor Nan Li. In this webinar, Saishan Li, that is with us today, will also join. As Chris also mentioned, we will have another seminar, another series of webinars coordinated within the MEDiate project. We are finalizing the work program, so we will have that information soon in our webpage that I already posted in the chat section. We also had some questions about the recording. This will be uploaded again in this same webpage. So if there's any question, any requirement, you can just send us an email at the UNESCO Chair email, which you already received the information about this webinar. So thank you, Marcelo.
Yes, and also just one last thing to the audience. You know that we have a LinkedIn page where you can join us, or indeed also through our email and website. Please get in touch if you have ideas for webinar, if you have specific requests on topics that you would like to listen to or propose speakers. We are very interested in hearing from you as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the invitation. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Marcello.
Thank you
very much.
again to
Thanks,
Chris and
Tina. Thanks,
Marcello
Rafael.
for the
Thank
Thanks
you.
for the organizing.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.